I have your recent book here next to me on my desk, actually. And when I saw that it was coming out, that you and Uppsala Books were publishing a book on Easter, I had pretty high expectations. And in reading the introduction, I immediately knew that you were going to address the things that I wanted to talk about, which is that if you
That's a
Google
relief.
yeah, if you Google origins of Easter, the sort of unsolicited AI overview will tell you that the name comes from a pagan goddess Ostara, and that things like the Easter bunny and eggs are like sort of pagan symbols of fertility that are borrowed into Christian traditions from the worship of this pagan goddess. Um, I was going to ask, is this a popular misconception? I don't think the word popular is up for debate. It's definitely popular. Is it a misconception, though?
I think it is, but I think what you have to the narrative that's often spun out on these various millions of sort of of various sort of messages and images and YouTubes is that Easter not only were sort of Easter eggs and Easter rabbits, Easter bunny, but the name of the festival, the very time of year, were all effectively sort of usurped by the Christians, that they were taken by the church from pagan tradition. That seems to be the sort of narrative that's often spun out. But what you have to ask yourself is, leaving aside eggs and Easter bunnies for the moment, um, Christianity developed out of Judaism. Sort of in the sort of, obviously sort of with and the period of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and Christianity was very much focused in the Eastern Mediterranean and then to the Byzantine world. And I think you have to ask yourself: is it conceivable that the early Christians would have um, both named and timed and taken the symbolism for their most important festival from a yet to be recorded Anglo-Saxon goddess in Northern Europe? Um, and I think sort of, that has to be the starting point. But also, I think that often these misconceptions start from a very sort of Anglophone, sort of centric view of the world. What you have to bear in mind is the majority of sort of modern European languages, Easter isn't even known by that name. It's known by the name Pasqua or Pascha or Pasch, something like that. And all of these names derive from the Hebrew Pesach, which is the name for the Passover, celebrating the Jews' exodus from Egypt, as told in Genesis. So um, I think it's inconceivable that the Christians would actually have taken sort of their festival from as I say, this yet to be recorded North European goddess. Then if you settle that issue to begin with, and then you move on to the actual symbols themselves of sort of eggs and rabbits, what we find is that the egg has been a long-standing symbol, Easter symbol within the church, certainly within the Eastern Church, and there's a logical reason for this. Eggs are one of the foods that are not to be eaten during the Lenten fast, Quadragesima, the sort of fast up towards Easter. And then finally, on Easter Sunday, they can be eaten at that point, with the Easter feast and so many of the foods that have been restricted being available to people. And indeed, even in the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, the Greek Church in particular, eggs are given on Easter Sunday, to handed to people with the phrase, Christ is risen, so they are handed as a symbolic gift that Easter has finally arrived. So I really see no evidence that that directly connects the Christian usage of Easter eggs, from some, as I say, a North European cult to a goddess called Eostre. And now that being said, of course, eggs are a universal symbol of sort of springtime and rebirth, and we find them in many religions and traditions. But that doesn't mean that Christianity took them from paganism. Then we come on to the Easter rabbit. And the Easter rabbit, very interesting. Easter bunny in America, but originating as the German Osterhase, the Easter hare. And the earliest evidence we have for that appears to be in southwest Germany, where in the 16th century there was a tradition, sort of folkloric tradition, that hares would lay eggs. And this may go back to the fact that sort of certain ground nesting birds, particular lapwings and hares, are nesting at that time of year, forming their, and so that may lead to part of the confusion. And then out of that appears to develop a tradition where, in that part of Germany, decorated eggs or just eggs were hidden in the gardens for children to find, and they were told by their elders that they'd been laid by the Easter bunny, the Oster Hasa. So I don't. Again, I think and that's a good 1,000 years after, or our first reference to the goddess Eostre. So I don't really see the evidence to connect them.
Right. So just in case people don't know, it is worth clarifying, I guess, that most Christians around the world celebrate Easter at the same time. There's a bit of a split between Catholics and Orthodox, and I think a lot of Protestants will generally follow the Catholic calendar as well there. What is the reason for the time of the year of that holiday in like Christian calculations? Why is it when it is?
Well, Easter is commonly referred to as one of the movable feasts, but it's the movable feast, and that's because it's set to quite a complicated calculation to do with the lunar months. The Paschal month is and the full moon within that month, and I think the formula is that Easter Sunday should be the first Sunday after the full moon, on or after the vernal equinox, on or after the spring equinox. And the reason for that goes back all the way back to some of the early church councils, the Council of Nicaea and those before, where what they were trying to do, on the one hand, they wanted to reconcile the fact that Jesus was said to have been crucified on the eve of Passover, on a Friday that was the eve of Passover. But at the same time, and then his resurrection was said to have taken place, on the third day, on the Sunday. But what they would often find is the early Christians is that by following the Jewish calendar for setting of the Passover, Pesach, that the third day wouldn't always be a Sunday. So they came up with this formula that would get the Easter be close to the Passover, but that it would be celebrated on a Sunday by Christians, throughout the Christian world at that time. But of course, that was in relation to the Julian calendar, which was the original sort of Roman calendar, which is very similar to the modern one that we follow in the Western world today. But then you have the Gregorian calendar reform, which came in because there was a slight inaccuracy within that. So now you find that the Orthodox, who still follow the Julian calendar, the earlier calendar, sorry, I moved my cat for a moment, follow the Julian calendar. They celebrate I think it's about 13 days earlier than the Gregorian calendar, whereas most people in the West, including Catholics and Protestants, would celebrate Easter.
Hmm. So then that's the reason for the date of the holiday. But then in England, we do get the holiday named after this pagan goddess named Eostre. What do we know about that?
Well, very little is the honest answer. What we know is what we're told by the Venerable Bede. Bede was a scholar, a monk at Jarrow in Northumberland, near to Newcastle upon Tyne, and in 725 one of his many tracts. He was a real polymath. One of his many tracts he wrote was on time, De Temporum Ratione, the reckoning of time, and in that the main element within that was computers, which was the means by which we calculated and established the date of Easter. So he was setting out all of the principles behind that. But in doing so, he described other calendars. So he described the Greek calendar, the Egyptian calendar, the Roman calendar, and he decided to describe his own native calendar in a chapter called De Mensibus Anglorum, the English months. And whilst he was listing those months, he named them. He described briefly sort of, what they related to or what he understood to be the origins of the month names, and explained that they form part of a lunar calendar, so that the Anglo-Saxons followed a lunar calendar based on the cycles of the moon. So probably alternating each month 29 and 30 days to create a full cycle. But with that, a lunar year would only amount to 354 days a year, which is about 11 days shy of a solar year. So every 2 to 3 years, they would insert an extra month. So he explained that process. But in one of the months he described was Eostre month, which is Easter month. And Easter month he equated to roughly the Roman calendar month of April. And he says that Easter month was when they celebrated a goddess, Eostre. and that the name of the month has and the goddess has come to be synonymous in England with the Easter festival. Sorry. Which was the Paschal festival, which is, of course, we retain the adjective form of the name in English. So that's as much as we know, really. Let's say that there was this festival or festivals, celebrations in that month to a goddess called Eostre that roughly equates to the month of April.
Hmm.
But within that month, obviously, we have a root. We have a root which appears to be the word East, so the East month or the Eastern month. Um, and, many people have suggested, let's say, well, I should start again. That then led to the speculation, let's say, that so, this goddess might be related to a similar month that was recorded in the Frankish calendars in Germany, Ostermanoth, in the calendar reforms of Charlemagne, that's called in Aachen. And that led the likes of Jacob Grimm in the 19th century to suggest that there was a German equivalent, Ostara. So this has led to this, well, many sort of iterations of the same sort of account, where and often again relating them to Easter eggs and Easter rabbits. So that's how we've ended up in this situation. But that's as much as we know, really, is what Bede tells us.
Hmm. And can we say anything about the character of this sort of reconstructed goddess at all?
Well, lots of archaeologists, linguists, and historians today now reject the idea that there was even a goddess Eostra.
Oh, I
They
see.
suggest that it's actually a back formation, that what we're looking at is effectively Bede's speculation that the goddess never really existed. I'm of the view that Bede is reasonably trustworthy, and that he would have lived. There would be people living that he would have known, who would have remembered the days of sort of Northumbrian sort of heathenism or paganism, and that he's unlikely to have just invented a fictitious goddess, particularly to explain a Christian festival. It seems sort of counterintuitive, really. So I start from the other end of the argument. What I would suggest is that if we can all agree that Bede was describing a sort of an Anglo-Saxon or Northumbrian calendar, that had existed, and he was giving us an honest representation of the names of the months. Well, what is an Eastern month doing at that time of year? In what could it relate to? An Eastern month in the month of April. And to my mind, the fact that and others have mentioned, many others have mentioned this before, but to my mind, I would say that the fact that the sun rises in its most easterly position at the equinox, around the end of March, beginning of April, it's around that time also that we see the full moon rise in its sort of most easterly position, either just before or after the equinox. Um, and so if we then accept that these, they do have, functional representation of these names, we have other names like Blood Month for November, when presumably they were slaughtering cattle. We have Weed Month for August, when presumably sort of weeds were growing in the fields were a problem. We have three milchi or three milchi, which is the time at which cattle were milked 3 times a day for May. So if you accept that we have these functional names of the month, an Eastern month, I think having a functional relationship to the positions of the sun and moon, I think that's a reasonable argument. And if we then accept that for sort of the pagan Anglo-Saxons, these things would have had within their polytheistic faith, that these things would have not just physical but also religious and spiritual symbolism as well. I would not reject the existence of what Bede's account, of a cult to the goddess Eostra.
And now, is the German form Ostara, is that evidence to suggest that this might have been a real goddess?
Well, I think then we run to my mind, we run into a few problems, and possibly here I may fall into the other camps of slightly deconstructing things a bit.
Yeah.
Um, having been a great defender of Bede. Um, I think we have here the complication of the Anglo-Saxon mission, the fact that a
Mm.
number of Anglo-Saxon clerics, most notably Boniface, went to northern Germany, as part of the efforts to convert the pagan Germanic tribes, largely of northern Germany, but also the south as well, but the Saxons in particular. And these people would have spoken an almost indistinguishable language, the Old Saxon, to the clerics who were coming across. So it's highly likely that they would have been preaching in their native tongue to these people. And so, if that's the case, then would they not have been using their common name for for Easter in preaching and trying to convert these individuals? So there's another route by which the names could have entered the German language through the Anglo-Saxon mission. Um, and I think when you look at the old High German names for Easter, Osterun and Ostermoneth, and look at those Eostren and Eoster moneth in Old English, the similarity is just so close. It strikes me that what you've got is effectively loan words going into these Germanic dialects, and then appearing in later sort of High German orthography in the forms that we see them. But having said that, I wouldn't completely reject, and I don't reject the idea that the Northumbrian Eostre is a representation of a much earlier, common Germanic goddess. Now, then the question comes is, had that cult completely died out in Germany and then the names were reintroduced, or was there some memory of it? And this was simply, a reinforcing of that, or a reuse of those names within within the Germanic dialects and then into Old High German. It's difficult to say, but I suppose I fall more on the evidential. I'm an archaeologist, so I'm the evidential side, that it strikes me that we have a clear route by which they could have been introduced. Also, we know that Boniface and his successors were requesting works from the scriptorium at Jarrow, from the abbot there. So. And we know that some of those books did arrive, and it did appear to indeed arrived in Germany. And we more recently, a number of manuscripts have turned up in Germany, which are actually folio from De Temporum Rationem itself. Unfortunately, not the chapter on the English months, but certainly suggests that text from England and from Northumbria had arrived in Germany, including Bede's work on time.
Right. I think actually, I was recently reading a biography of Alcuin, and I don't remember if it was him or one of his like close associates or friends was the monk in Northumbria who received the requests for the works of Bede and sent it over. It was either Alcuin himself or maybe one of his like
I think it would probably be one of his associates. Alcuin, certainly, he was at York, wasn't he? He would have been in that circle, knowing
uh-huh.
people from those. Yeah, I'll be interested to hear if you can remember which reference it was. I'll be
I'll
interested
dig
to.
it up and try to
Yeah,
find it, and
yeah,
maybe I'll
but
put
that
it
would
in the
certainly make
description.
sense to me. Yes, yes.
And then, so if there was this sort of Eostre goddess, you have in your book linked it to the sort of, and I think most people who cultivate a sort of faith for this goddess also do this, link it to the sort of dawn goddess concept. Can you speak to a bit as to what that is and sort of what kind of tropes or motifs we see around these kinds of mythological figures?
Yeah, I think the problem is what people tend to do is I'll just preface this by saying this is they tend to take the aspects of all these different traditions or cults or what have you, and then wrap them up into one nice neat package which all fits together. Unfortunately, what we have is only slight overlaps or inferences between them. So we
I
end up
see.
often on the internet with this sort of perfect package of the universal Indo-European dawn goddess. Um, and I certainly wouldn't support that. But I think what I would say is that from the beginning, once let's say there was an understanding of the relationship between the Indo-European languages, so those are the languages that are spoken in northern India, hence the Indo part of it, and right the way through sort of Afghan, through sort of the Punjabi into Iran and through into the European languages, we understood that there was a relationship between these, they were a common family. People started to look for similarities, between their not just linguistically but mythologically as well. So we've had both, so, over 150 years of both comparative linguistics and comparative mythology. And Grimm, in his work, formed, in Germany with his Deutsche mythology, formed part of that as well. And I think sort of, there are four goddesses. I think would confidently say, we can say are related, which would be the Indic goddess Usha, the goddess of the dawn, which is mentioned in the Rig Veda and many of the hymns there. Say, the goddess who would herald Surya, the sun god, arriving every morning, and then
Mhm.
Prati Usha, her sister, who would see him, away in the evening, and she would arrive on her cart pulled by red calves. We
Mhm.
then have the Usha, which is probably a borrowing into Farsi and Zoroastrian tradition as well. Um, we then have Eos, the goddess of the dawn in Greek mythology,
Right. Yeah.
again heralding the arrival of Helios, the sun god, and she arriving on her chariot, this time pulled by some white horses. We have, and then of course in a Roman tradition we have Aurora, who is almost identical to Eos, but of course there was a lot of borrowing, in Greco-Roman mythology. So
Right.
as the name would imply, so I think there's a link there. The question then is whether sort of if we accept that Eostre was a dawn goddess, or was a goddess certainly associated with the arrival of the sort of equinoctial sunrise. If we accept that, is that a Germanic reflex of this Indo-European goddess? I'm open to that. I think I think there's merit in that. Obviously, there's only so far you can go with the evidence, but I think the Baltic languages are interesting. You're one of the sub branches of the Indo-European family, and again, there we're told by 16th century scholars, but at a time when many of them were being forcibly converted from sort of Baltic paganism, that they worshipped Auska or Ausha, a goddess of the dawn. So we have the Baltic peoples on one coast, on the east coast of the
Uh,
Baltic Sea, and then on the other side, on the west coast, we have the Jutland Peninsula, and we have the homeland of the Anglo-Saxons. So to suggest that Eostre might in some way be connected to these dawn Indo-European dawn goddesses, I think it's not. It's a tenable argument. Yeah.
mm. Interesting. One other thing that I want to kind of bring up that you mentioned in your book is we have these sort of votive offerings discovered in 1958, I think, to these sort of female figures described as the Matronae Austriahenae. Um, who are these women, and do they kind of figure into our general Eostre Ostara network?
I think they're interesting in the sense that they're from a part of Germany that was on the west bank of the Rhine. So it was within the Roman Empire. So these were
Hmm.
Germanic speaking peoples, Celtic speaking peoples in those areas as well, but Germanic speaking peoples, the Ubi, who had collaborated with the Romans and had lived on the east bank of the Rhine, but then for their own safety were then sort of resettled on the west bank. So, and it's within their territory that we see this concentration of Matronae goddesses who appear to be very localized, to areas with and they where votive altars and temple sites have been excavated where they worshipped these mother goddesses who appear to have had sort of ethnic, or localized links. Um, but I think that one of these names is the Matronae Austriahenae, and which is interesting because if Germanic, the Austria element at the beginning appears to be cognate with the East and therefore with Eostre, which is very interesting. But I think we've got to be careful and not jump to conclusions and say, aha, we've got proof therefore that there were continental, German goddesses being called, named after the East, and therefore this is, directly related to Eostre. They could be, parallel developments. And the reason I say that is that the Matronae tradition, we find it in northern Italy, but there they tend to be unnamed. They don't have specific names. They're just the matres or matronae. Whereas in sort of northern, in parts of Germany and France, we find them with having names or tribal or localized names. Um, but the actual Matronae element of it is also found in Gaulish tradition as well. As these mother goddesses, and it appears possibly what we got is we've got, let's say, a Germanic people, the Ubi, adopting Romano Celtic or Romano Gaulish traditions, religious traditions, but then applying their own linguistic element to what is, a Latin and Celtic sort of,
Mhm.
suffix, so suffixal sort of, structure in naming them. So I'm I would be very, very careful about sort of, how far you take that argument. I think sort of, what it does show is, let's say that certainly sort of that it could form a a goddess name or a deity name within a Germanic language, but that is within the Roman Empire. We've got no evidence of these triple deities, of these triple mother deities, that is, and the use of this name outside of that within sort of the wider Germanic world.
Are they like goddesses? Are they sort of like spirits? How should we kind of understand their sort of
I,
theological position?
I think we should see them as ancestors. They are
Okay.
ancestor goddesses. They are mother goddesses of that. Probably a locality or or an ethnic group, sub tribal group of people within those areas within the Ubi, and they're probably a unifying factor as well. It's interesting. We also find dedications to Matronae here in Britain as well, particularly on Hadrian's Wall. Roman troops who were probably far from home relating to their mothers across the sea, which is quite interesting as well. So again, this collective idea, of sort of like celebrating or worshipping their ancestral mothers across the sea. So that sort of bound them together as well, even though they were probably from quite from disparate areas. These different legions. So it is quite interesting, but I think we've got to be careful, not too hasty to jump to conclusions.
Right, makes sense. So there's one more thing that I want to bring up that you discuss explicitly in your book, and that is at Yeavering, we have a discovered structure which seems to be some sort of grandstand, almost like an Anglo-Saxon like theater or something. I'll put a picture of it up here so the audience can see. What's going on here? What is this? And does this factor into what we're talking about at all?
It's a real enigma. Back in the 1940s, aerial photography rediscovered the site of Yeavering or at Yeavering, which was an early Northumbrian royal centre in the Cheviot Hills. And it was quite stunning, the aerial photographs that were taken at the time, just after the Second World War. And then in the sort of late 50s into the early 60s, the site was excavated by Brian Hope Taylor. The site was found to include sort of earlier prehistoric structures, burial mounds and enclosures, but also sort of a really complex sequence of timber buildings, halls and other structures associated with various post settings. And these post settings very early on were seen to have interesting alignments. One in particular, which Graham Hope Taylor referred to as an axis of structural symmetry across the site, and it connected at least 3 to 4 major post settings and on each sort of roughly east-west line. It connected the 2 largest halls, running through the sort of the end doors of these halls, these large rectangular Anglo-Saxon halls, and then through this really unusual structure, this trapezoidal structure, which comprised one of the posts as its sort of focal point, and then 9 arcs or radii coming out from it, which formed what looks like the sort of wedge section taken out of an amphitheatre. So, and what Hope Taylor surmised was that this was indeed sort of like a grandstand or theatre type structure of sort of tiered seating that were used for sort of, great meetings and moots, of the sort of, in terms of sort of that royal centre and how it operated and and also that they sort of, later people suppose that it sort of bestowed sort of a prestige upon the sort of, Edwin and the early Northumbrian kings, because it expressed, something of a sort of a classical Roman pedigree to it as well, so that we're
Yeah.
taking prestige from this structure, as well as having a sort of a political or unifying function. Um, and that's been the generally accepted view for a long time until sort of the early part of this century. I think there was a conference in London at which Richard North has first suggested a really interesting paper, which hasn't yet been published, but it is available online. He suggested that the post settings are possibly astronomical alignments, that they were to do with the sunrise, marking positions of the sunrise on the local horizon. Um, and that this might well be to do with regulating the calendar and the setting of sort of Bede's calendar months. The problem with that was that as fixed solar settings on the horizon, they wouldn't be able to mark the position of lunar months because the lunar months will move 11 days. They retreat each year because the lunar phases are out of step with the solar cycle, so it wouldn't work. But I was fascinated by this idea, so I started tinkering around with it and spreadsheets and looking at sort of the position of the sun on the local horizon at Yeavering. And I think there is merit to this, but I think it wasn't so much setting the exact positions to the solar calendar as to when these months began, but it was a means of regulating them because within that image, you'll see there is that you've got three alignments marked in relation to the structure. You have one that goes that indicates an azimuth or a bearing of the sun of 99.5 degrees, one that indicates a bearing of 86 degrees, and another that indicates a bearing of 45 degrees. 45 degrees at that latitude, at Yeavering's latitude, and only at that latitude, would be equivalent to the summer sunrise on or just after the summer solstice, which I think is quite significant. But when you look at the other alignments as well, then the 86 degrees, which is the axis of structural symmetry, and then the next one, the division between the interval between those two, so that's between the 99.5 degrees and the 86 degrees, that interval that's marked by the sunrise on those dates amounts to 19 days. Now, 19 days is a really important period in the lunisolar calendar in terms of regulating the difference between a solar year and a lunar year, because it's the difference between 13 lunar months and one average lunar year. And that's used because if a full moon occurs within that interval, you can say that it's a common lunar year. That's a 12-month lunar year. But if there is no full moon with that interval, then it can be an embolismic or a 13-month lunar year. And using those two alignments and using that interval enables you to regulate the calendar that Bede described. It enables you to regulate a lunar calendar. Furthermore, the other interval, which is the interval between 86 degrees and 45 degrees, amounts to exactly 3 lunar months. That means that the lunar phase at that interval at 45 degrees, and then the interval at 86 degrees would be the same. So if it were a half moon on one, it would be a half moon on the other. If it were a new moon on one, it would be a new moon on the other. And if it were a full moon on one, it would be a full moon on the other. So if you can regulate with the first two intervals, that's the one between 99.5 degrees and 86 degrees, you could use that 19-day interval to regulate the months, the number of months in the lunar year. And then you can use the other interval to actually tell you what the moon phase will be at the solstice. You have a clear mechanism for regulating the lunar year.
Huh. So that tells us then that they did care about at least the regulation of the lunar year and stuff. What does that kind of point to in terms of our investigation of Easter?
Right. Well, I think the fact that Bede describes in his ecclesiastical history, he describes Yeavering, he describes the arrival of Paulinus and baptizing people in the Glen River, arriving with Edwin and his court. So we know that it was an important royal centre at that time, and that's at the point of the conversion. That's when Paulinus arrives in Northumbria, and obviously, okay, we know that then there was subsequent we went back to paganism, and then finally sort of to convert the final phases of conversion. But we know that that's that first interface between the Christian church and those peoples at that point. And if Bede is also telling us that the pagan calendar that was used by those people at that time, he's described that for us. If we accept those to be narratives that we can trust, then I think it's we can then infer, let's say that that this structure may well have been something that was designed to regulate the type of calendar that the Bede was discussing.
Hmm. So it does seem then that all of the sort of things that we can grab on and be sure of are just kind of these like very sparse facts that we are attempting to sort of build on, but maybe not really easily. Would you have, let's say someone is watching this and they want to kind of build, like a sort of pagan faith or like a cultivation of, let's say, this Easter goddess. Do you have any advice for them? Would you encourage them to look elsewhere and into like, other avenues, or is there something that you would maybe steer them towards?
I mean, the
It's a
first part,
difficult topic.
yeah, I'll break it down into two. I think the first part is that as an archaeologist, I'm used to not having all the facts.
Yeah.
Archaeology doesn't come up with all the answers. And what you're doing is you're constantly building a narrative, to try and explain the past. And that narrative may be filled by new evidence, but that often poses even more questions. So it's a constant process, an iterative process. And I'm happy that continues. And hopefully I'm injecting something into that myself. So there's that side of it as an archaeologist, and I don't have a problem with it. I think it's the gaps in our knowledge are what things I really enjoy. I think that sort
Mhm.
of being able to try and piece things together from very limited evidence. And people may look at what I'm saying, hey, well, you just haven't got enough evidence to say that from the evidence at Yeavering. Well, I'll say, yeah, what I'm trying to do is to construct a narrative that explains something that I don't believe other explanations have adequately done.
Right.
But as I say, it's an iterative process, and others will join that in decades and centuries to come. In terms of those trying to construct or support their modern faith, or based upon this evidence, I suppose I'd say, try and build from the evidence that's in front of you. Do you know what I mean? And don't worry about the gaps. Don't necessarily feel forced to fill the gaps. Often and I don't know enough about sort of like modern sort of people are trying to follow modern Anglo-Saxon faith. It's not an area I've particularly gone into, but from what I know from having read sort of material about modern neo-paganism like Wicca and what have you, is that often people try to fill every single gap. They try to completely fill it and completely explain everything.
Mhm.
And to my mind, I would say, well, if it's about faith, why are you worried about the gaps? Just accept that there are gaps in our knowledge, go with it. What we know is what we know. I'm not really a spiritual person, but I do feel a deep sense of connection with sort of, with landscape, with language, with tradition, sense of place. And that's my sort of spirituality, but it's not faith based as such. But that's full of gaps, massive gaps in that. But in a way, just celebrate them.
Huh, well, that's very nice. Thank you for sharing that with us. I want to talk about one other aspect of your research. That is, you've done a bit on sort of early medieval instrumentation, which I find really interesting. And I was recently reading your research on bone flutes and tabours. Is it tabours or tabors?
Well, yeah, there's yeah, there's a debate about that. Most of the modern pipe and tabor players say tabor,
Tabor.
but that's but having said that, others will say tabor. I think it's a choice between it's a we could do a song about this, couldn't we? A transatlantic song. It's tabor or tabor. Potato or potato. It's all there. So I wouldn't worry too much about that one. Yeah, my interest is that in a previous role, I was a county archaeologist for Bath and North and Somerset, and then before
Hmm.
that, I was city archaeologist in Gloucester. And when I arrived in Gloucester back in sort of the mid 90s, I was very interested in music. I played guitar and banjo, played a bit of folk music, what have you. And I thought to myself, well, let's see what they got in the museum collections, because I was actually based within the museum service. And they had a fascinating collection. It included sort of like in the folk collections, there were various early brass instruments before they invented valves, where you had crooks. You had to put different size crooks in to expand the harmonic series. They had various wind instruments and drums. They also had, interestingly, they had a tabor pipe or a tabor pipe, which from one of the Cotswold villages from Chipping Campden in the collections. And then in the archaeology collections, they had the mouthpiece of a Roman cornu, which was this large military trumpet. I think there's a depiction on Trajan's column and other places as well, but this large circular military trumpet. But also, there were other items as well. There were Jaws harps, sometimes called Jews harps. Jaws harps, so you play with your mouth. Very early ones, medieval ones, and also bone flutes. A couple of bone flutes that have been excavated in the city, and I was particularly interested in those. And I decided to, branch out into a bit of music archaeology. So they hadn't been written up. So I decided to write a short note on those. And that got me interested in the fact that they were very simply made from the shaft of, one was from both were from a bird bone. One was from the leg bone of a crane, and the other was from the ulna or the wing bone of a goose, with what's a duct flute mouthpiece or a fipple flute mouthpiece. That's like a modern recorder, like a block flute that you blow down. So you don't have to form the embouchure with your lips. You can just blow into the instrument. And then 3 tone holes. And there were lots of discussions about how they would have been reconstruction, because the blocks didn't survive. And I went with beeswax. I thought beeswax was the obvious material. So I made some reconstructions, wrote them up and what have you, put that to one side for a while, and then came back to it, some years later. Because there were other instruments as well that needed looking at. But in the meantime, I actually got interested in playing the pipe and tabor myself. So I ended up spending many years learning to play. And effectively, it's a one-man band. You play a pipe with your left hand, and you play the tabor with your right hand, striking it with a drumstick. So the tabor is a drum. Tambor or tabor being the earlier name for a drum. And it's a 3-hole pipe, and you use the harmonic series. So you blow up through the harmonic series as well as using the finger holes to create at least an octave and a half of notes. So I played those for many years. And also wrote up a couple of other important finds. One was a bone flight from the Yorkshire Dales that had been excavated back in the 50s. Excavated with a burial in a Bronze Age, a secondary burial in a Bronze Age round barrow. And at the time, the excavator, Arthur Raystrick, who was a sort of a well-known, renowned local archaeologist, he'd suggested that it was Iron Age. But based on the finds and based on some of the other finds that he'd identified it as being Iron Age, principally knives, including typical angle-back blades, working with John Todd from Kent University, we suggested that it was actually they're actually Anglo-Saxon, that it's an Anglo-Saxon secondary burials in this earlier Bronze Age barrow. The other finds, Bede suggested that as well, and based on that, we then suggested that, given that the only other instruments that we have found in Anglo-Saxon burials are the much higher status sort of lyre burials, sort of Taplow and obviously Sutton Hoo, where you have these stringed lyres found. It's the only sort of other instrument to have been found in an Anglo-Saxon pagan burial. So that was one, and I think, and then more recently, working on a bone flute from Waterford in Ireland,
Yes.
Which medieval, later this one, probably from just before the Anglo-Norman sort of conquest of Ireland. So, but within an area that was called the Viking Triangle, and that's because this is one of the early Norse settlements in Ireland, and this one was made from a a swan ulna, which is and being such a long bone, it has capacity, not just, let's say, for six finger holes or seven, like a recorder. It could actually have taken many more than that. But in fact, there are only three. It only has three at the very far end, furthest, from the mouthpiece. And again, that's suggestive of it being possibly an ancestor of the tabor pipes. That
Hmm.
was another one I wrote up recently.
Is there anywhere that the viewers can find your recordings of the music you've made with these instruments?
They can. If they go onto my academia page, you'll find a link there to SoundCloud, and there's a few recordings I've done there. Now, warnings: some of the shorter whistles are really shrill. They're really quite high pitched, so you may need your earplugs before you listen to the recordings. But yes, yeah, that's somewhere else
I'll
you can look.
have both the academia and the SoundCloud link in the description for people who want to check that out. I was listening to those right before the interview. I thought they were pretty
Okay,
cool.
right.
Um, so last question, and just kind of the vaguest one possible. What is like your favorite aspect of studying archaeology? You kind of mentioned briefly that you are sort of not bothered by the sparseness of the facts, but I don't know if you would describe that as your favorite aspect of archaeology. If not, what would be? And I'd also like to know if there's like a story from your research you'd like to share with us or something like that.
Okay. I think the first one's probably, yeah, it is sort of related to the idea about celebrating the gaps in our knowledge, which is
Hmm.
it might be a strange thing to say, but I suppose that obviously I'm interested in archaeology. I'm interested in linguistics. I'm interested in folklore. I'm interested in religion, and hopefully those elements all come together. In the book. Um, but I like about the sparseness of the evidence within archaeology is that how can you bring those other disciplines to bear? How can you, let's say, and archaeology sits at the meeting point of so many other disciplines as well. It sort of begs and borrows off lots of other disciplines, and sits at the meeting point of them. So I suppose that's what I really like about archaeology, and that's why the way you can branch out into other fields from it, I really quite
Hmm.
enjoy. In terms of an anecdote or something to, something in my sort of archaeological past, I was chatting to my wife about this earlier, trying to think, thinking through, well, which one should I choose? And this is I worked in before working in Gloucester. I worked in Scotland for about 5 years, and I went up to Scotland it would have been the winter of 1990 to 1991 to supervise excavations on a headland sticking out into the North Sea in the middle of December,
Hmm.
which is sort of so which is not the best place to be. It almost had permafrost at times on the site. It was so cold, and the daylight was quite restricted. You couldn't really start working until after 10. You had to finish by 3 because you didn't have the
Oh.
daylight to actually see what you were doing or recognize the difference, the color between the soils. Anyway, the reason we were there was we were excavating a site which had, in the previous season or two, revealed the most northerly Grubenhaus or sunken featured building in Britain. And this is now in southern Scotland. So this is in
Hmm.
Dunbar in East Lothian, not far from Edinburgh. And we were excavating that and later remains on the site as well, but a really important early Anglian site. But at the same time, and the reason we were doing it was they were constructing a new swimming pool there for the town. And one of the machine drivers came over to me one lunch break and asked me, about the site and what we found. And so I started giving him a description, started explaining about sort of this earliest sort of Anglian or Anglo-Saxon phase and the buildings that had been found. And he asked me, he said, "Oh, so I didn't realize it." He said, "I didn't realize the Anglo-Saxons had come here." And he was a local man. And he said,
Hmm.
and when did they leave? And I said, well, they didn't really leave as such. And he looked at me aghast. Because for him, and I'd suddenly realized what I'd said, for him, Anglo-Saxon was equivalent to saying English. And of
Right.
course, being a local man himself, he very much considered himself to be Scottish. And it sort of first taught me how central archaeology could be, and my naive way from having come up from southern England, and my naive way, how central it could be to people's sense of identity or not.
Right.
So anyway, that was a. I got away with my life. I managed to talk my way out of it. So,
I
uh,
don't suppose he had an English last name, heaven
Uh,
forbid.
well, I don't know. I don't know. So if you did or not, but yeah, a lowland name rather than a highland name. Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes. Anyway, yeah.
that is pretty funny. All right, Richard Sermon, thank you so much for coming on the channel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.